Hey everyone, Cynics here, and this is just going to be a fun little bonus video for all of you wonderful Patreon people. So, it's not going to be heavily edited. In fact, I don't think I'm going to edit it at all. It'll just be a clean playthrough of a sequence that was saved from a previous study that I did earlier this month, and I'll just talk about it a bit more, maybe go in depth a bit more on some random painting stuff. But for the most part, it should just be casual and fun. So I earlier in the month did a photo study of this person, Tiffany Poon, who's a pianist. They have a little YouTube channel, and I sometimes like to watch YouTube channels of other creative type people that aren't necessarily artists. I watch a lot of things of having to do with modelers and musicians and just anything that feels like creative, because usually their thoughts on the creative process or just being a creative person are slightly different than maybe an artist might be, but they're also related. So I try to find inspiration and influence anywhere I can. So for this little reference, painting, drawing, and by the way, I might have to take pauses to breathe once in a while. I forget because when I'm normally editing videos, I just kind of edit out large chunks where I'm taking a drink of water. But once again, I'm not going to edit this one, so just casual. Just bear with me if I have to drink some water or something. Right out. Mm. Great, delightful. When I'm doing a study of a photo, there's a few different approaches you can take. But for this one, I'm really just focusing on angles. You'll notice that when I'm doing the initial drawing, I'm using basically all straight lines and just angles. Because, in my opinion, the best way to get that accuracy at the start is to really focus on hitting the angles of all the different negative and positive shapes. And then you can really kind of measure in your brain if you're getting it right. You can break up all of the little different, maybe little angles of light or just different shapes of color and value. And if you can subdivide those in your brain and just see them as geometric shapes and symbols, then it's a lot easier to make sure you're being accurate. Sometimes you just do that later on as a test to see how accurate you are. But personally, I just approach it like that from the start. So it seems to work out okay most of the time, although it tends to also make your drawings look a little bit stiff and sometimes they lack a little bit of life. But for the purposes of painting, I think it'll be fine. If I was trying to make a nice drawing in, say, my sketchbook, I probably wouldn't take the same approach of focusing on just these straight lines and angles everywhere, because it's, once again, just going to look a bit lifeless. I would probably try to use a bit more of my imagination and just use the reference to kind of tell me where to take my imagination, but kind of let my intuition fill in some of the gaps. I think that works better if you're just trying to make a drawing. But for a painting, we can leave the drawing stage very rough and just use it as a guide for future purposes. And if you want an accurate guide, you can focus on those straight lines and angles. You should always be able to look at two intersecting lines or shapes and process in your brain what kind of angle it is. Is it a 90-degree angle? Is it like a 60-degree angle between the two lines? Are certain things perpendicular? Are they parallel? Where do certain angles hit other parts? So it's just a whole lot of making sure you're finding relationships between lines and shapes that work for you. And that makes it somewhat easy. The other thing is, you might notice I'm placing the eyes and things. They don't feel entirely accurate. I'm not super impressed with this drawing. And I should add that for the most part, during this whole painting and drawing, it was kind of an off day. I did this over the course of technically 2 days. But the whole time I was working super slow. And it just, you have bad days now and then. It's hard to say exactly what might cause you to have a bad drawing day. Usually, though, it's just something's off with your energy levels. Maybe you didn't get a good night's sleep. Maybe just something to that sort. You're just out of your rhythm, and it tends to make you draw slower or faster. And I find that if you're not drawing at your ideal speed with your ideal tempo, that you're drawing, you'll just have a bad day. You'll have a bad drawing day. So ideally, you can try to recalibrate yourself by just either forcing yourself to do something slightly abnormal, like draw with your left hand or draw blindly, do one-line drawings. Just do something that's going to kind of reset your mindset. One-line drawings are generally good, where you try to draw the whole thing with just one line. Maybe if you're at figure drawing or something, or you're drawing from a reference. Or you can try to just recalibrate just by setting a timer and making yourself draw super fast, or making yourself draw super slow. And then eventually, hopefully, when you mix all that stuff together, you'll get back to your better, normal, healthy tempo, whatever the tempo is that works for you. It's a little different for everyone. Not everyone should be drawing at the same speed or at the same tempo. I'm using speed and tempo as separate things because usually it doesn't matter quite how long you're taking, because some people, it's a matter of mixing in quick lines and slow lines as well, which is what I'm talking about when I say tempo. Anyway, enough about the tempo stuff. We're moving on to the color phase. And I should talk about the brushes a little bit. So you can see I did the whole sketch phase with just that chalky texture brush. It's really just for the purpose of having a brush that isn't very definite. And I find that that's been useful lately, just for the sake of doing stuff like pre-painting stuff. But anytime I don't want to get my brain too wrapped up on line work or get that really sharp, confident, angular line work, like I don't want the line work to be important. So I'm using something where it's kind of going to be diminished. Now, I will say, ideally, in most painting processes, I would color the line work first before moving on to color and all this process right now. But I didn't do that. I don't remember why. I just didn't find the need to. I should have, though. Now that I look back at this, I'm like, why wouldn't I colorize the line work? You should always colorize it if you're drawing a person. Just make it like a saturated red color. It'll make the whole process better. It'll prevent you from getting muddy colors later on. But I guess since this line drawing is a little bit in the grayish tone, I didn't go for 100% black with my brush or anything. Hopefully, now that I'm working on a separate layer and it's multiplied, once I put in all these colors, it should saturate the line work just a little bit. So, unlike most times when I'm just drawing from imagination, for this one I do have a reference. A lot of the faces I draw and skin tones I do are from imagination. But for this time, since I have a reference, I'm trying to be fairly accurate with it. And that makes it, I guess it's a little bit easier in terms of you don't have to think as much. But you also have to be extra observant. So I can't just rely on tips and all the things I normally do, comfort zone type stuff. I have to really be focusing on making sure I'm getting the right color for each area. But you might notice this underpainting I'm doing, which, by the way, the normal painting process is line work. Then I do this underpainting multiplied. It's just on a multiplied layer. But I just do that as kind of a rough way to get in all kinds of base colors. And then eventually I'll merge the two and just move on to a more painterly painting approach on a single layer. But I'm trying to be as playful as I can with the colors at this stage, especially in the skin tones. It's very important that you bring in as many colors as you can during this stage. I've said it a lot in basically every video that's involved painting, but it's a lot better to go way more exploratory and experimental and creative with colors early on rather than trying to bring in fun colors near the end. If you do it early on, it lets you kind of see a bunch of good ideas, but it also lets you dial it back if you need to when you get into the more rendered stage. So it's good to be playful at the start. Explore as much as you can, because this is where a lot of the fun stuff's going to come into painting in the early stages. Now, I will say, even though this is based on the photo, based on the reference, I am taking liberties just a little bit with the colors. Now, it's something that I think is super important when you're doing anything, drawing from a study, drawing from life. When it comes to colors, we don't just want to be photocopiers. We don't just want to be like photographers, cameras, I should say, just taking pictures of everything. We want to add a little bit of embellishment, a little bit of our own personal taste and everything. So the main thing that I do personally when I'm trying to just do a reference of a skin tone or something is I look at that skin tone and I try to decide which areas are the cool areas and which areas are the warm areas. And you really can train your brain to start seeing areas that and processing them as, okay, these areas are blue or cool and these areas are orange or warm. And even though, technically, if you looked at it, the photo, they would all be in the same family, in the same orangish tone. But in my brain, I'm trying to divide them up into cool areas and warm areas. And when I'm doing the underpainting, instead of just using like subtle variations of orange to show the cool areas, I'm actually bringing in cyan and some blue tones. I find it's a lot better overall, and it'll create a much more appealing look, in my opinion. One of the things I liked most about this is bringing in those blues. You can see them on the interior side of the eyes, closest to the nose. When I looked at the photo, technically they're not blue like that, but it gives off a bluish vibe when I look at it. Your opinion of the photo may be different, but when I look at it, I can almost feel those cool tones in certain areas. So I try to exaggerate them as much as you can. One of the best ways to get a good painting is by making sure you have a mix of warms and cool tones. It's not just values. You do need, very importantly, a mix of dark values and light values, but you also need that mix of warm and cool. Otherwise, your painting's just going to lack interest. It's going to be lacking that extra life that is really enjoyable, in my opinion. So that's something, by the way, that I like to practice even when I'm not painting, even when I'm not around, any of my art stuff. If you're just out and about, you can always look around you at random things. You can look at anything, by the way, not just people, not just skin tones. Every object you see in the world, whether it's, something sitting on your desk, some building out and about, always look at it and decide in your brain. Try to pick out, what would I decide are the cool tones here and what are the warm tones? Even if everything's super warm, you can still have that comparison and exaggerate it. So even if everything's just orange, maybe part of it's slightly desaturated orange, and then in your brain, you can say, that feels like the cool area, and then the more saturated orange, that feels like the warm area. But anytime you look at things, you should be trying to get in that mindset of getting more used to identifying cool and warm, because it'll make your paintings have a lot more life and a lot more interest to them in the end. And it's just fun, It's like little art games you can play with yourself no matter what. You can always be analyzing things in some way. So back to this painting. Now, this painting, it's super low contrast, as most things are. Anytime you're in the real world, things usually don't have very dramatic lighting schemes like you'll see in movies or fancier photography or illustration. If you look at illustration and you look at movies and things, there's always a much more stronger sense of lighting. They always have a direct light source. They have a fill light. So they have these combinations of things, and usually it creates a very dynamic look. But in real life, just everyday, normal light settings, out and about, sitting in a library, doing whatever, you'll find that the lighting is much more even, and there's no real drama going on. So it becomes a lot harder and more difficult to paint for the most part, in my opinion, because you're dealing with changes on a much smaller scale, which means your accuracy has to be much stronger. You can't just rely on having big sweeping shadow areas and big sweeping light areas to really punch out those values, and then you don't have to be as accurate. If the change between dark and light is just a matter of a few tiny little shades, you have to be way more accurate. So I personally think it's way, way harder to draw things that look like they're just lit evenly, I guess you could say. The type of photos you normally would have on your phone, selfies and whatnot, because this is just a regular picture. I don't know if it's a selfie or whatever, but it's just a standard picture like you would see of anything. And these are, in my opinion, the toughest to get right. So, yeah, a little bit of that. Okay, back to brushes for a bit. So I actually use that whole chalky brush again for the entire base color layer, which is good at some ways. At least it's very loose, which I like for the rough stage, but I don't necessarily like how much of that texture it's leaving everywhere, because I know I'm just going to have to smooth that out and paint that out. Maybe sometime I can figure out an even better brush for laying in these rough colors. But anyway, at this stage, we've been at it for a while, but I'm painting, I merged those layers like I said I would, and I'm just painting everything on one layer. Now, like I said, since this one is a matter of subtlety and not like a normal dynamic, real strong lighting source, I'm using a ton of airbrush. So normally I paint, you might know, with a lot of dry brush, which gives you some really hard lines, hard edges, I should say. Gives you some really hard edges and then lets you blend it out a bit. Well, this time there's basically no hard edges in a lot of this stuff because it's so subtle. The dry brush isn't very good at subtlety. It always kind of mixes the paints darker, which means that it's very hard to get a subtle shift in your colors and values. So I'm almost entirely doing this with a lot of airbrushing, which is very abnormal for me, but I just thought it would look a lot more realistic. So it's a lot of just laying in those colors and slowly smoothing them around with a soft edge brush. I think at this point in the video, at least, when I did this, I was talking a lot about, how to create slightly better lighting, like rim lighting on things. So instead of just doing a thin line around the edge of stuff, which is, it's not the worst thing, but if you ever can, it's better to add in actual shapes, no matter how small they might be. Some triangular shapes, some shapes that feel like they taper and they have wider areas and smaller areas. It's always going to be much more appealing than just having a thin line somewhere. Thin lines in paintings are the worst, and I say that as I, make a bunch of them everywhere. But early on especially, try to avoid thin lines for lighting and everything. So what else can I mention? It's been so far, it's been just a matter of mostly trying to get the values and contrast to look right on the skin tones, and they look okay. The nose is a little bit lazy and stuff, but it's fine. The eyes turned out okay. I feel like eyes are pretty easy to cheat at though. You can just basically have an eye color for the white of the eyes. Make sure, once again, never go white, but use a color that's basically just the skin color for in this case, or just some approximation of some color that's not too far off, and just make it a little more desaturated and a little simpler. I think this is, I'm getting distracted because at this time you can see all those little hatching lines I was going across. I was explaining, I think if I remember correctly, I was just talking a little bit about stroke economy and how to properly use your brush strokes when you're painting. And I guess I can mention that now. I know it's a side tangent, whatever, I'm all over the place. Doesn't matter, casual painting video. But generally, you want to follow the contours with your strokes when you're painting. No matter what you're doing, whether it's just a little airbrush, whether it's something else, it's just a very good habit. Anytime you're doing anything, follow the contours with your lines. Don't just scribble in like has no direction or it doesn't matter at all. Try to either be following the contour in a parallel way or a perpendicular way. So kind of think of it like a grid. You're either going against the contour or I should say, you're either going perpendicular to it or you're just following it. But one or the other, that's going to make your overall appeal and the strokes of everything read a lot more and just look a lot better. Man, that's a complicated amount of nonsense. Anyway, back to the eye thing I was mentioning because I completely forgot. You can see how I didn't really spend any time rendering out her pupils themselves. They don't even technically have pupils. It's just kind of a mess of an iris and pupil combined. But that wasn't super important. What's super important... Oops, sorry. What's super important with the eye is just getting that nice reflection in there. The eye is, I would say, easily the most reflective part on the face. So it will always have the reflection of the environment in there. Theoretically, you can just kind of base the eye stuff completely around the room that the character is in or the person's in. But you should always feel like it's just reflecting the environment. So getting those strong speculars especially just brings the eyes to life. You don't really need to worry about anything. See, once again, there's no real iris definition. There's no pupil definition. It's just kind of a dark blob. And I tried to make the eye look slightly rounded by adding some shadow to the top and maybe around the edges. Just kind of bringing it around. But it's the highlights, the specularity that really brings some life into it. So always be thinking about that. And that's also why you never want your whites of your eyes to be anywhere close to pure bright white, because that's going to ruin any chance you have at adding those specularities. You aren't going to be able to pop that extra life into things. So I spent a ton of time trying to just get this hand to look right. Once again, it wasn't my best time. I wasn't having the most productive, most efficient day. Everything was a little bit weird. But, it came together somewhat. I was just following the photo best I could. I smudged things around a little bit, trying to get the shapes just right. But the most important part, I think, of all this hand stuff is really getting the saturation right. It's very easy, especially when you have things like those back fingers or the palm of her hand, things that are in shadow, it's very easy to get them to look muddy. So as an artist, you really need to push those saturations on your shadow areas and dark areas. I like to do it a lot, especially on skin tones. There's other types of materials where it's not important, but when you're drawing people and you're drawing skins, just make sure you're going heavy saturated on every shadow. Bring in those really strong oranges and reds and everything. The darker and more in shadow something is, generally the more saturation you want to bring in. That will keep it from looking dull and lifeless and just anything terrible like that. Yeah, so all that stuff, pretty useful. I'm still not like 100% happy with the hand or anything, but it looks okay. I was able to simplify, some of the fingers into just those shapes. But I guess it's a good time to just remind everyone that if you're not drawing with the right energy and the right tempo and the right speed, things will just always look lifeless. No matter how much you render them, doesn't matter. If you don't have the right tempo and speed behind your strokes and all your lining and everything, it's gonna be, you're fighting an uphill battle trying to make it look good. So I was definitely doing that a bit. But in the end, I think if you keep working at it, eventually you'll find the tempo, even if it takes you forever and it's just very fleeting. I think at some point I was starting to at least feel like I was in the right tempo for parts of the hand. But it was definitely a slow process. Anyway, on to the hair. And by the way, I changed the background completely. The background in the photo was very white, and I could have done that, but I just wanted to stick with something simple that wouldn't compete with the foreground character at all. So I left it with some implication of like books or a bookshelf in the background, just something in perspective with a lot of vertical lines. But instead of going for like super detailed with all the books and everything and bringing it to that lighter tone, I thought this nice cool greenish tone will complement all of the wonderful warm tones I have in the hair and in the skin and everything else. So anything that will make the character pop up a bit off the background, in my opinion, it's a good thing. So this is going to be a while just rendering this hair here. And personally, I'm going to try to be a bit more photorealistic than I ever am with hair, which is kind of tricky because I never like to be photorealistic with hair. But the same basic rules apply. I'm trying to block it out into areas first. I don't want to get wrapped up with tiny lines at an early stage. I know that to be photorealistic with hair, I will have to add those tiny lines, but at the first stage, you want to make sure it looks completely realistic and believable with big chunks of color and value. And then once you get those big chunks working, you can go in there and start kind of breaking up little details here and there. You don't want to be drawing and rendering every little strand of hair. You just want to make sure that the breaks between the dark areas and the light areas show the density and texture of the hair. So anytime you got like the break between those shapes we established, you had the light shape and the dark shape, you want to make sure that in between them, you can add that texture, that little bit of stranded hair, thin little lines. So you're kind of using them like little patterns here and there. Just after you've established everything, don't do it first. Make sure everything is completely just good looking without any thin lines. You always work from big to small. So if it's not working big, you don't move on to small lines until it looks great at the big size. But I'm also adding a ton of flyaway hairs, which are just those little light, bright lines here and there, especially on the silhouette of the hair. Those always tend to make things look a lot more realistic. It's a simple, easy trick. You add a bunch of those hairs that are just catching the lights and they're flying away. They're just single strands kind of whirling about. I added some around her bangs and a lot around the side of the head and everything. Generally, you would save them just for the silhouette if you had to, but I'm adding them a little bit crazily everywhere, and just trying to have my fun with it. I thought the whole hair part was a little bit too brownish looking or just a little bit lifeless, so I added just a tad of that glow brushing effect just to make the colors there really feel like they're in the lights, like they have a little bit of that specularity. Hair, once again, hair is very shiny. Not quite as shiny as eyes, but hair is definitely shinier than skin. So hair can reflect a lot of light, and you can get a lot of kind of some level of specularity on it. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff like that. The hair, though, it turned out okay. I tried to use some more bluish cool tones for the really strong highlight areas. Once again, on every area, not just the skin, on the hair as well. You want to make sure you got warm tones and cool tones. You don't just want it to be warm tones. That'll leave your hair looking very, I don't know the right word for how it'll look, but it won't look good. Trust me, I used to make my hair look very crappy all the time. I would try to paint it, but I would use only like orange tones for the brown hair, and it wouldn't have those blue tones, and there's something about monochromatic hair that just never looks quite realistic or right. So it just takes you out of the image a little bit. You'll find that anytime someone paints really good hair, it'll just have that slight hue variations. It won't just be monochromatic. It'll never look good if it's monochromatic. But especially on the highlights, since I guess once again we're indoors, maybe there's a lot of blue in the ambient lighting, the ambient lighting. You'll get a lot of that blue highlight on things, and it'll be a lot cooler. But anyway, this is just rendering the shirts, and if you want to get good at rendering clothing, you gotta approach it. Just pretend it's a hard surface thing. All the folds you see, pretend it's like made of marble or something. In terms of lighting, at least, really carve out each crease and each fold, as a really solid piece, and it's gonna make you feel a lot better about your stuff. Don't leave it nebulous. Don't leave it just kind of loose. Make sure you're defining a lot of hard edges in your clothing, and it will generally look a lot better. Now, I was messing around a lot trying to bring in different saturations of blue and everything, but it's okay. Oh man, I don't know. There's a lot I could have probably talked about. But the important thing is that even though it's just a blue shirt, that you're still mixing up different saturations and bringing in just slightly different tones here and there. It doesn't have any warm tones, but oh well. Sadly, I will say I forgot to record the final part of this image where I added the details to the shirt. And by details, I mean there was a little pattern on the shirt. But there was no real trick to that. I just took a basic drawing brush and just drew the shapes. Wasn't really painting them on. I was just drawing them on. So I would just pick a color that seemed appropriate for each area of the shirt. So obviously, if an area of the shirt is in highlights, you'll use a much brighter tone for like the white shapes. Or if it's in shadow, you'll use a much cooler and less noticeable tone. So it's just a matter of picking a color for the right area, but it was just a matter of drawing them. So, you know. I guess that's it. I don't know. I should talk about a bunch more stuff, but I don't want to. I don't want to edit and think about the video too much. I'll try to do more of these, and I'm sure there's a ton of stuff I'll think to talk about in the future. I know, and it's fine. We'll just move on. I hope you enjoyed watching this. Hope it was fun. I know it gets very rambly when I'm not really thinking about what I'm gonna say. But I guess it was a good time. I'll post the full res image of this as well on Patreon, so you'll be able to see this video and then analyze the full res image to see what I was talking about with different things. Because I know video compression and everything, you can't get a full idea for everything. So hopefully that'll be good. And thank you for watching. I know a lot of people probably won't watch it. It's weird, you know. I'm going off on tangents again. You know how many people on Patreon like pay for stuff and then never actually participate or watch anything? I used to put up videos more regularly and they just didn't get any views, and I was putting a lot of time into editing them, and I was like, oh, that's not a lot of time, but I was spending some time and they would get like 0 views, and I'd be like, well, I don't know, this is kind of lame. But I'm going to try it again, try to start adding some bonus videos on here, and we'll see how it goes. So thank you everyone, and I will see you again shortly.